Other panel. Okay, and then, okay, so I see the time, and I forgot to ask, so this time is including questions? Yes, okay. So because it would be great to get a few questions, so I'll try to end a little bit earlier. So thank you, Gio, for the super inspiring presentation. I'll try to do my best with the boring numbers after such a presentation full of pictures. But what I would like to present to you today is actually the work of Domino. Domino is one of our younger working groups in CIDOC. Domino's work is about bridging the gap to Iberoamerica, bringing the work of CIDOC in Spanish and Portuguese. Being inside of Domino, we have a few lines of work. One of them has to do with identifying software that might be accessible to smaller museums with smaller budgets. We are also having a line of work that deals with translating some of the standards that we use in CIDOC into Spanish and Portuguese. We also have a line that deals with identifying the skills that museum professionals need to support documentation work. And one of the lines is what I'm going to present today to you is the work that we've been doing to survey and inventory what's going on with documentation in Iberoamerica. I'm one person here presenting, but we're a full team that worked on survey and analysis. We've been meeting about once a month for the past, it's been a while. And we are Juliana Rodriguez, who did a lot of the work on the translations into Portuguese and dissemination in Brazil and Portugal. Marcela Covarrubias, disseminating in Chile. Paula Casajus, disseminating in Argentina. Pedro Angeles, disseminating in Mexico, and me sort of also helping around also right now with the presentation. So here we go. I would like to start with some of the examples. What can we do with documentation that you guys might be perhaps familiar with? The case of the Retrato de Diego Martelli by Edgar Degas. This is from the Museum of National Fine Arts in Argentina. We see that here is a painting with two documents. These two documents come from the archive in which you can clearly read and see the friends of the museum purchased this painting and were able to donate it to the museum for the museum to hold an exhibition. We also see a letter from the curator about this purchase and thanking the friends. Right after this exhibition, Paris was taken over and you know the story of the Second World War. So in this case, it's really important to have such information to document the provenance of objects and the movement of pieces if you ever need to get them back. Another example is from, whoops, let me see. Yes, I know I see mouse moving, but that's not me. Okay, sorry, I got distracted. The second case is from the Exposición del Coloniaje from 1873. This is perhaps a little bit more modern case, perhaps also more ancient case. This is an exhibition that was prepared by Marcela Covarrubias. If you speak Spanish, you're very welcome to join us in the session of Domino on Wednesday evening. She will be presenting. She's our keynote for the Domino panel. She'll be presenting this case. She prepared an exhibition about a historian who did an exhibition in 1873 about this idea of the colonialism from a very critical perspective. And so one of the paintings shown in this exhibition in 1873 was from this illustrious Spanish army leader who supported the colonialism. But the painting was included actually to criticize this role as this exhibition was trying to sort of one of the first decolonizing the museum sort of efforts in 1873 in Chile. So Marcela did this new exhibition, and there are no images of this exhibition, but there is, and there's this, let me see if the pointer works. Well, this image in the middle is the catalog of the exhibition of 1873, in which states that this painting was part of it. Sort of the context, no painting, but still there's other images available and other documentation available to clarify that this is the painting that was involved in this exhibition by this historian in 1873 and so on. And so you see another example in which documentation can help those activities beyond documentation. The first example on the recuperation of paintings, after the Second World War, and this example in the creation of new exhibitions. As the Dutch start always, let's start with putting some basics on the table. What is documentation? So in our working group, as Monica started actually this morning with her introduction to the CIDOC 2021 conference, we consider documentation as the acquisition and systematic processing of information within a museum's knowledge network. What's that? So as museums acquire collections, they research them and they exhibit them, they build this knowledge base. And whenever there's a new object coming in to the collection, this is positioned within this context to increase or to expand this knowledge of the museum. So why do we want to document? Well, because documentation gives value to the objects. Why? Two reasons: by associating these objects within other objects in the collection, by linking with other concepts within the collection, and by placing them within a context to give them meaning. We believe that objects are because of their documentation. Oh no, I missed my example, but let's take this as an example. We know that this is a very important pointer because it was used in the first physical CIDOC meeting after the pandemic, and actually the first hybrid CIDOC ever, and only us who are present here will know that. But if we document it, maybe a bunch of years from now, people will be able to realize that this is no normal pointer, but a very special pointer held by all of the keynotes that are taking place in this conference. That is how objects are because of their documentation. As we've heard also within this conference, collections remain inaccessible, leaving the value of the objects untapped, as well as these riches of the museum sort of unexploited. We believe that documentation stimulates the optimal use of collections. So what did we do? The survey. Our main question was, what is the state of documentation in Ibero-American museums? We ran a survey in Spanish and Portuguese. We disseminated this online between the fall of 21 and spring of 22. We have three main sections: about your museum, about documentation, and very important, we added some value questions. We wanted to catch what were museums' perspective in terms of positioning themselves as part of a global knowledge heritage network. So this is the best part of the survey. I'll present some main results. First, we got 139 responses, and you see the breakdown from 13 countries. Mexico and Argentina have a 23%, followed by Brazil, 18%, and Chile, 12% of responses. In terms of the museums, we asked them, when was your museum open? Almost more than half are museums born after 2000, and we get quite a bit that are born after 1950. When we ask them, what kind of share of visitors do you have, nationals, internationals, we find 80% of museums very much rely on national visitors, pre-pandemic. The question was pre-pandemic. And then we asked them, tell us about your use of the internet collections online. Do you use social media? Yes, 88%. They all have profiles in any of these. You see Facebook is one of the most popular, followed by Instagram. A few museums, 24, have some relationship with Wikipedia. This signals to us that digital communication is very much used for that, communicating. However, this information side of the collections remains somehow unexploited. So there's lots of work of us to do there in this section. You notice there's 22% of responders knew about CIDOC. So we have also lots of work to do there. Then we ask, as others have mentioned before, resources. How's your staff? So we ask, do you have staff who are allocated specifically to the work of documentation in museums? We find a quarter of museums have no staff allocated to documentation. It's a wonder that museums function the way they function, with all of their volunteers and with all of their collections that they have. We have 32% of respondents said they have some staff that sometimes work on documentation, and 43% of respondents do have staff allocated to documentation. Not full-time, sometimes, most of the times, it's only part-time. The hours allocated for documentation range between 1 hour a week to 240 hours a week. This is when in larger institutions when more staff is available. On average, respondents said 20 hours being allocated towards documentation per week. When we ask, okay, you document collections, and then how often do you update them or make sure that things are up to date? We see 76% of information systems are pretty much static. These are institutions that maybe update their system once a year, almost never, or never. When we ask them, do you update weekly, monthly, or quarterly, we see a very low response in that sense. This is a little bit worrisome, but it's understandable when you see there's very few staff allocated. And here's a quote that might be resonate with you from one of our respondents. Documentation, and this is a translation, sorry about that. Documentation is essential in museum policy, and digital technologies considerably facilitate such work. However, managers do not share such views and limit support in the area. And so we hear some frustration from documentation staff not being valued, not being recognized in the importance of their work and giving the resources to do so. And then we ask, okay, let's talk about documentation. We divided the question on 2 levels. So the first level is very much on sort of the basic documentation for inventory purposes. So do you have an object? Yes. Where is it? Can you find it, sort of thing? Just real basic information. We find 74% of respondents said, yes, they do have more than half of their collection inventoried. And then we ask, well, tell us about documentation at a deeper level. Do you describe collections a little bit more on the historic context or something else? And we see that 26% of responders don't do any of that. And about half of respondents have half of their collection with some form of additional contextual information. So we have also a lot of work to do there. When we ask, do you work digitally, analog, or hybrid? We see the digital transformation going on. What is this digital transformation? We've heard from it before. Institutions largely work for hundreds of years on analog form. They have their collections in cards. And then these wonderful systems come in, and so they have to transfer all of their data, which is double manual work. And then they have to, before they can drop the analog system, they have to maintain both. And so this is what you also see here. The systems are largely still analog because institutions are trying to catch up with these new technologies. So we see there's a lot of collections, there's a lot of work, there's little stuff, and we have this new technology that's giving us double work to do. Oh dear, huh? Something else that we see with this graph is that the use of documentation is largely supporting the administrative work. What is that? Do you have an object? Where is it? Can we move it? In case we need a loan or in case we need something else. But the documentation system is not properly supporting scientific research. And when we have curators doing their exhibitions, planning their exhibitions, we see with little documentation, it's difficult for curators to use the system. When we have scientists doing preservation of collections, again, contextual information and additional files on preservation, all these sort of things are missing from the systems. So these systems that we're talking about on documentation are largely just for administration. Where's Mika? We were talking about, he presented about this earlier. And then we get into our 3 best questions when we talk about values. We ask respondents, to what extent does your museum value documentation? 76% of respondents said, yes, we value documentation, even very much so, more than half. But then we asked them this question about documentation, in other words, and only 78 responded. Why? Because here we asked them to really break down the levels of documentation. Is it just basic? Is it basic advanced? Is it contextual? Or is it really, going all the way? And we see that, from those 78 that didn't respond, the little bit that did respond, the majority of the documentation is still quite basic. So we see that even though there's a wish and evaluation of the importance of documentation, this is not yet been resolved. And one institution, interestingly enough, said lack of staff and time prevents us from advancing documentation in spite of having many tools and know-how. So we can do it. It's just that we cannot manage. Second question on value was about publication. Does your museum value sharing collections with the world? Again, more than half said very much, and majority said yes. However, when we asked, do you publish collections online? Almost half of museums said nope. Of those that do publish a little bit of collections, we see is actually quite a little bit. This has to do, as well as we've heard also before, there's a lack of understanding of intellectual property rights and what does it mean when you publish collections online. We can get into trouble. And so here we see a great need for Domino's work, perhaps to train documentation specialists on how to do safe publication of collections online. This was quite a hopeful slide for us because we see that there's the interest to drive all of the hard work that still needs to happen to publish our collections online. And the last is about valuation of the collection. Does your museum hold valuable objects in terms of world history? Yes, absolutely. 70% yes. Yes, we have objects that are valuable for humanity at a global level. Again, more than half said very much so. When we asked them about, do you use object ID? Monica mentioned object ID this morning again. Is one of the basic standards we use, was launched in the 1990s. It's been quite some decades to its basic standard that sort of translates the documentation we do for internal use to sort of external users. If there's a need to locate an object because of theft or any other reason, we can send this small card directly to Interpol, which are not museum experts. And so this simple translation of the documentation card for non-experts seems to be quite a challenge, unfortunately. Again, almost half of the museums don't use object ID. And we find that this also has given us perhaps some agenda points for the work of Domino in the coming year. Because valuing your collection is really not enough. We need to make sure that we use these standards to help us advance our work. In the last few minutes, I would like to then propose some closing remarks on these 3 last points. So first of all, documentation staff is aware of the value of their collections and of the value of the work that we do. CIDOC, as Monica said, is one of the largest international committees and one of the oldest international committees in ICOM. But somehow a recognition of the work sort of remains, something to wish for. we find that the challenges based on this survey, and I guess you will recognize some of these challenges, are associated with 3 main points. First is the resources. The work is largely manual. Permanent, knowledgeable staff is not guaranteed, even in large, important collections, to take care of large, important collections. Second challenge is the technology. Our current systems were not designed from within, and these are not supportive of the core work that museum does, as Jill presented as well. You know, she's trying to support all sorts of things that museums do on documentation, on education, on preservation, on accessing the collections, and so on. Documentation enables all of these. But again, these systems seem to sort of only favor administration. And the last important challenge, we believe, has to do with this conceptualization on what is documentation. It's really very much a tool to stimulate the optimal use of the collection, and without the valuation of collections and on museums. A second closing remark is documentation remains largely, again, a manual activity. For that is extra expensive. As we've heard, lots of the work of museums is done by volunteers. In the Netherlands, more than half of staff of museums are volunteers. Amazing how the country runs, eh? A new approach is required really to tackle this backlog. We could consider 2 options that have been mentioned throughout this conference, and as we've heard in other conferences as well. The first is about inclusive documentation. Inclusive documentation is a concept that has started here in Estonia. They have tested and quantified actually how when museums are able to provide a system for their communities to contribute with oral history or with the contextual information, documentation can speed up quite a bit because their expert staff can focus on, for instance, control vocabularies and all of these very specialized activities that support the information system. But all the rest that's quite requires quite the amount of labor can be done also by the communities. And Jill also presented sort of a case on that, on how community can support with oral history. So we very much support this idea that inclusive documentation can not only improve, speed up our processes, but also support the dialogue with communities and maintain the information systems up to date very much. Another option includes the artificial intelligence. There's some institutions that are having all of their images read by a system and have proposed sort of first initial selection of fields, and then a person could maybe help clean those up and then advance documentation, but at least you have a first start. So these are some options that we see in the field and might take more importance later on. And the last closing remark has to do with documentation is key to advance museums' work, supporting all core activities, and to enable the role of museums in society very much as memory institutions. We definitely need new strategies to integrate documentation within the museum process, not something that happens, you know, afterwards or hidden or but that happens continuously at all the time, supporting and hand in hand with all of the core activities. We urgently need to find new ways to ensure that this documentation takes a more active role in our museums, so that museums can be also more prominent in society, in our information societies. And I would like to leave you with imagine if documentation is able to enable the exchange of collection information among all of the museums of the world, those of us here, but also those online and beyond, so that museums could provide a sound infrastructure of diverse and quality knowledge accessible for all. Did I read this properly? Hope so. You can read as well. Great. Well, thank you very much to all of the respondents of our first survey, and hopefully many more to support our future surveys. Thank you very much.
So, Trilja, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really, it's a really good way to be a part of organizing a program committee, because people bring the different stories from another side of the world, actually, to you at home. So that was really, literally, exactly. We don't have any questions at the moment in workshop. But I was also listening for a moment, and while we don't have any questions at the moment, but you can think about the questions, I had one thought, it was amazing how big there can be a gap between the values of museums, you value different kind of documenting and et cetera, but at the same time reality is very harsh. And you were also mentioning volunteers, but what about university students as internships? As interns, could they maybe give some kind of solution?
These are probably, and this is a work that we'll be doing and engaging in the coming years, in which we're trying to actually shed a bit more light in who are our volunteers currently, and who are our potential volunteers that we sort of neglect or perhaps don't give enough attention. And for sure, the university students are the natural partner of museums, because they are training perhaps to become part of the museum force, perhaps stay and not go further, but it's very much the number one. And it's not only the low students of art history, of low technical students for that input data, but very much senior researchers. We have Christian Emil, or many scholars here who also very much contribute to the work of museums at a different level, and their contribution to museum work is never accounted for. And these are very important volunteers who are also supporting the work of museums. And perhaps what we need to do is also enable the way that all of this work done by researchers is brought back to the museum for the museum to perhaps enrich their information systems. This is something that, and I'm not sure if Dominique Remondino is listening online, but this is some of the work that Geneva is working on in the Museum of the History Museum of Geneva. The goal is right now to link the information system, all of the collections, to scientific works. All of the publications about the objects should be linked, so that if you are encountering or the academic publication or the object, you will have automatically, the author to support your inquiry.
Mm-hmm. I see. And now we have a question also in workshop. Inclusive documentation. What about the challenges?
Okay, excellent question. Thank you. And so I'm really pleased that we're here in Estonia, because this is where this term has been born, and I love it. I think it's very sharp. So the challenges with inclusive documentation are, yes, many. And so first of all, we can divide two main sides. First, the inside challenges. So that means the museum must enable the other to share their information. So the museum is not the only expert. The museum can take a more coordinating role. And this change of position somehow remains rather challenging for some institutions. And so it has to do with understanding that perhaps, yes, you are the expert, but there's other individuals that also might not be working in your museum, but whose knowledge also counts at a different level, in a different way if you want, but still quite valuable. And as museum experts, they can still collaborate and together enlarge the knowledge and understanding of collections. So I think that's the main challenge internally, how to enable a system that sort of authorizes or makes this external data authoritative. The challenge with the outside, let's say, is how do you deal when there's multiple conflicting views about collections? And we know that heritage, cultural heritage, is of all of us, but we all have different backgrounds, and therefore we all have different views on why heritage might be or not valuable. An example is here just next door, the monument of the Second World War, and there's this new monument here. If you haven't walked around, it's beautiful on the with trees and so. And yeah, there's contested histories there. So whose view should prevail? Should we take down some images? Should we take down some things? And this is obviously quite a challenging process of discussion and of sort of understanding each other's views and coming to an agreement. The great thing of digital, in particular databases, is that you can have multiple views at the same time without the need to demolish the other. Everything can exist parallel and support each other, or come in discussion with each other, and you don't need to break anything down. So in that sense, discussing online and digital data sets are easy. I won't get into how to deal with the monument here next door.
But this is a really tricky question because, in theory, it sounds very nice that museums should be and are forums of negotiations and very important forums for democracy. But at the same time, how to organize it, like in practice, and how to deal with those different kind of opinions and voices, and as you said, the negotiated histories, which we also have here quite a lot in Estonia. So at the moment, okay, but this is a long topic again to discuss. We do not have any more questions in workshop. Does anybody have any questions here in the audience? Aha, I see. Laura has a question. And in a few moments, I hope people can pass her a microphone.
All the way.
Oh, thank you.
According to the Gathered data, I was wondering if there were significant differences amongst the countries.
The breakdown of countries is, well, our data set, as you saw, is quite limited. It's only 100 and a bit more. And of 18 countries, many of them have only a couple of participants sharing their data. So it's a little bit difficult to make big statements about differences in countries at this moment. However, if we look at it sort of very largely, we do see a very similar reality to many countries also in Europe. I haven't actually included some of the data from other surveys in Europe, but we see still that half of the collections remain not visibly online, and lots of the collections are still not documented digitally, and so on and so forth. So we believe that even though our survey population is perhaps not the ideal and not the largest, our numbers are somehow echoing what we see also in Europe. And Europe, I don't mean, all the big rich museums, but the larger Europe, which is the majority, are quite small museums, with large collections. Yeah. Great question. Methodology.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for this question, and also thank you also for this answer. But I'm also checking the clock. So
yes.
Thank you so much for this presentation and also answering the questions. Is there any more question?
No.
No,
okay.
no.
I thought from Egypt. Okay, I love a question from Egypt about Latin America. But I thought, yeah.
But there is not at the moment.
No, thank you.
So thank you so much again for this presentation and also for the replies. So let's give another applause to TriIce.
Thank you very much. Thank you.